So my name is Grace H. Cooper. I am 21 and I live in the south of England.
Okay, it's so lovely to be talking with you. So first, I just want to ask how you found Probably Genetic.
So I firstly got involved with HemeNet about a year ago. I was familiar with one of their own kind of advocates, which is Luke Pembroke. I've kind of followed him on social media since I was like 15, and he was the first person on social media that I ever found that was an advocate for haemophilia and Willebrand disease and things like that. So when he then kind of started getting involved with HemeNet, and then he was putting out little kind of questionnaires you could do and things, I then got involved through them, and then I signed up to do a few of their things, and then Kate Kahir from HemeNet then just sends me stuff when she has it and asks if I'm interested, and I always say yes.
Oh, excellent. So you're really a part of a community that can help share resources. Okay.
Yeah.
That's excellent. And so what I would love to just hear about your experience with von Willebrand disease. So tell me about whatever you feel comfortable sharing, symptoms, or how you decided to pursue a diagnosis and when that happened for you.
So I'm really, really open. I'm a pediatric nurse by background. So nothing's really like off limits with talking, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
We're very, very open book. But so I was diagnosed with von Willebrand's at a really early age. So I was diagnosed at 7 years old.
Okay.
Which is quite uncommon. I've done other like consultancy panels for other research companies, and I was the youngest diagnosed by a really long time.
Really?
Yeah, most other women that are on these consultancy panels were diagnosed in their like late teens or 20s or 30s or 40s. So yeah, when we all had to share obviously our experience, I was like, oh, I was diagnosed at 7. Everybody was like, wow, that's really, really early.
How were you able to do, I mean, obviously that was up to your parents, I would assume, but what led them to pursue that for you?
So my mum's also a nurse. So she was actually a student nurse at the time. So she was studying to be a nurse. And so it was 3 accidents kind of leading up to really being concerned if there was something wrong. So when I was about 4, I cut the bottom of my chin open with doing something silly that, you know, normal
kids
children do. Yeah. We had a lovely cream carpet at the time that had to get replaced because I just bled out.
Oh my gosh.
My mum had to put me in the bath because I was bleeding so much. But luckily, we literally lived across the road from the hospital. So we were able to get there. And obviously, my mum was really concerned. And the doctors was like, oh, you know, she's just a kid. You bleed a lot from the face anyway.
Right.
I wouldn't be worried about it. Then about 2 years later, I was at school. And I slipped over and I whacked my head on the bookcase. So I've even got a tiny little scar going through my eyebrow. Scarred the poor little boy who was looking at me whilst I literally had blood going down my face.
Oh my gosh, so horrible.
So then went back into hospital to the same kind of accident and emergency department. They said the same thing. It's from the face. You know, my mum was going, this really isn't right. They were like, just, you know, a kid, we see this all the time. I was, as a child, like I would fall over and I would scrape my knee and it'd bleed a lot, or I'd always be covered in bruises. So I'd often.
And really quickly, is that something that you hear a lot with other patients, is that you'd go in to see a doctor and they would brush it off and say, it's because you bleed a lot from the head, or you're just a kid. And is that a very, very common?
Yeah, it is. Well, especially because I'm now a children's nurse, that's something that, unless you had other symptoms going with it, kind of whenever doctors think about bleeding or anything about bruising and bleeding, they immediately think of like leukemia and things like that, rather than like a bleeding disorder. So they immediately go to oncology and cancer and things like that. So obviously they would associate that with other symptoms. But the kind of defining factor was when I was 7, I was being a child and I climbed up a marble staircase just on my hands and knees, and then I whacked my shin against like the corner of it. And I had a hematoma like the size of a tennis ball. Like,
oh my gosh.
I couldn't put weight through my foot. We were on holiday at the time. And we got back and we went again to the same hospital that I'd been to before. And they were like, she's definitely broken her leg. We're going to do an x-ray. So then they did an x-ray and I was fine. Like, they saw it and they were like, oh.
So no broken bones?
Yeah, no broken bones at all. And they were like, wow, okay, that looks a lot worse than we would expect. And then they kind of re-referred me back to my general practitioner, which is like a family doctor. And they spoke to my mum and they were like, has she always had a lot of bruises? And she's like, yeah. And then explained my other kind of injuries I'd had before. So then they did a full set of bloods, including a clotting screen. And obviously when they did the clotting screen, they could then see that I had a really delayed clotting time. And that's when, because a clotting screen is often done on a really basic set of bloods, because that was majorly delayed. Obviously, that's a really big red flag. So they called my mum to come in like straight away as soon as they found out, which was really, really traumatic for her, because obviously bruising and bleeding and things like that, everybody thinks about leukemia, especially childhood leukemia. So it was a really, really big scare for her. And it's really funny looking back on it, but at the time, my mum walked in fresh from being fresh from a shift as a student nurse. So she'd just been in the hospital, got the call and said, I need to go. And my mum walked in and she goes, is she going to die of this? And he just went, well, probably, but not right now. And that's the first thing he said. And my mum was just sat there.
Kidding.
Yeah, my mum was sat there bawling her eyes out, and she was like, what the hell is going on? So then he explained, I'm going to have to refer you to hematology. Like, it's nothing to do with cancer, I don't think, but I've got no idea what this thing is. I've never heard of it before. I'm going to have to refer you to our hematology team, who knows more about it. It's to do with bleeding, but we don't really know anything. But obviously he had to say, you need to have a blood test as well as Grace's biological dad. So yeah. And then they both got tested, and then it came from my dad. So yeah.
Okay, so did you experience genetic testing at all during that time? Or have you since?
Yeah, so I have had a set of genetic testing done at the Royal Free in London, and I had that done just over a year ago now. And
did you learn anything insightful from that?
Yeah, I learned something really insightful, actually. Unfortunately, throughout my entire life, I've had a really varied response to treatment. So the traditional treatments like DDVAP, which is desmopressin, tranexamic acid, I have a really low response to. So it has never been a line of treatment that I could use, because when I first got diagnosed, they then put me in hospital for a day to then go through all of the treatments to see what the best response was.
So initially your treatment, you didn't have any adverse effects. It just wasn't effective at all.
Yeah, it wasn't effective at all. So how they do it in the UK, at least, is that you have bloods before you have it, and then you have it, whatever the drug is, and then 15 minutes afterwards you have bloods, and then 2 hours afterwards you have bloods. So then they compare your levels. And with the synthetic drug, which was DDVAP, which normally has a really good uptake for von Willebrand's, just did not work for me at all. So
because that's the number one treatment, correct? Yeah. Okay.
So I had absolutely, like, my levels did not change at all. So they were
that
like,
really scary.
Yeah. So immediately they had to move on to factor replacement. So I have Willate, which is one of the brand names, which is BWD concentrate, as well as factor 8 as well, which is human derived. So they then obviously had to give me that, and my levels were significantly better. So that is my first line of treatment when it comes to a hematoma or any bleed or pre-surgery or things like that.
Are you satisfied with that treatment now?
Unfortunately not. So I've been in hospital a lot. And
So sorry to hear that.
yeah, it's just, I guess it's quite, for me, it's normal because I was diagnosed at such a young age.
Right.
But there were a lot of times where I was in hospital and I wasn't getting better, and I was having factor replacement therapy up to 4 times a day, and I was still bleeding. And they were doing my pre and post levels, and actually my post levels were coming back as really rubbish. And my consultant, who had looked after me since I was 7, was like, Grace, I don't know what's going on. Like, I've never seen this before. And then one of them, whilst I was in hospital, he did pre and post levels and they barely changed. And he actually said, this must be a lab fault, because
really? Because it's that unusual.
Yeah. So I then ended up getting referred to the joint gynae and hemo clinic at the Royal Free, and they said, that's really interesting, would you be interested in having a genetic screen? I said absolutely. And it actually came back that I have it's really difficult to explain. I have a type of von Willebrand's that doesn't fit into type 1 and it doesn't fit into type 2, but basically I use the factor product really, really quickly. So my body clears the factor product really, really quickly, and that can be quite variable. Yeah. So
your body processes it, it becomes less effective.
Yeah. So it's meant to raise your levels, off the top of my head, for at least like 2 to 4 hours, or sometimes it'll raise a person's levels for like 6 to 8 hours, and you should be at a normal person's level. Whereas for me, I could drop within 15 minutes sometimes. So that's why then the bloods were showing like this has barely raised her levels at all. Like, because my baseline levels are really, really low. They wanted anything kind of over 80, like 80 to 150, and I was going from like 7 to 40, and they were going, this is really rubbish.
Yeah.
So when I had that genetic screen done, and they were like, yeah, this is, what we thought, it was good, but then again, really relevant to the work that you guys do. They said to me, they were like, there's nothing we can do for this. There's no treatment out there that you're like, there's no alternative. We don't have anything else, but it's good that we know. And they were like, maybe in 10, 20 years, they might develop something for this, but like, that's kind of, it.
Have you found any, or are you participating in any clinical trials based on your test results and trying to find a good treatment for yourself?
So I haven't done anything specifically for my test results, just because research into von Willebrand's is so minimal. Like, I've only got into research this past year, and again, most of it was kind of quality of life related, because in the UK, at least, a lot of research goes into haemophilia and types of haemophilia, whereas von Willebrand's is just didn't really take an interest for a lot of people. So, but I am taking part in the Richmond study, which is obviously, hopefully, after the observational period, going to trial the monoclonal antibody treatment, which again was like a breakthrough when I heard about this. Because of my nursing background, I know exactly what monoclonal antibodies are used for.
That's what I was going to ask. Yeah.
I was like, wow, okay, monoclonal antibodies are used all the time for kind of rare diseases, for cancers, for IBD and things like that. So I know that they're really, really effective. So yeah, ever since I got into research, I've always literally just said yes to everything I can, even if it's even if it's a 10-minute survey, I'll do anything.
Yeah, because you want to move the needle. Like, we want to make progress. And I feel like research, to your point, on Willebrand's has really been stagnant for decades. Like, the treatment options have stayed exactly the same for a very, very long time. So how did you find out about this study, and was it easy for you to gain access to it?
So how did I hear about the study? So I heard about the study through HemeNet. And again, I only knew about HemeNet, one, because of social media, but also because of my bleeding disorder nurse. So again, like I'll talk to her a lot about, again, because she does haemophilia as well. So she was always aware of, again, the genetic therapy they were doing for them. And she'd always like update me and things. And then as soon as I got involved in research, I was like, oh, do you know so-and-so? She was like, oh yeah, like I see her often. And then again, I would tell her and be like, oh, you know, I've seen this. Do you think I give it a go? She's like, yeah, absolutely. Like there's no, I guess because there's been so minimal research, it's like, if there's anything, go for it. And that's my personal opinion as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if there's anything that I can help or have to do with it, I absolutely want to do it. Yeah, because like you said, it's been really stagnant. Treatment options are so limited.
Right.
And all of my professionals that are involved with me have gone, this is really shit for you. There's nothing much else we can do. So the fact that, you know,
so frustrating to hear.
I'm like, I'll do anything you want me to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that these trials, they can be draining, or they can be difficult to find or access. And I think that's the bigger issue, is that I've talked to a handful of rare disease patients who do want to participate in clinical trials, and they're writing people, they're reaching out, and they're either not hearing responses, or they're not, or they just can't even find them to begin with. Yeah. And that is also very frustrating, because if this is your test result and you want to do something to change it, and there are opportunities for you to do that, and you just can't get admitted, or you can't find them, that's extremely frustrating. So what, let me see. I just have a list of questions here that we've already covered naturally, because you gave me just a really, really good synopsis. But I want to check to see what I'm missing. So it sounds like you are very, we kind of covered that already. Yeah, you're good. You've clearly done this before. What would you say to someone who may have, so in some ways you've been very lucky being diagnosed so young. What would you tell other rare disease patients, or someone else with your condition, about pursuing genetic testing, and how that could change their patient journey?
I think when it comes to my condition specifically, it's really, I'm trying to think of the right words. So being a female, it's so important that a lot of symptoms to do with bleeding disorders are very easily picked up in men, in the fact that they're covered in bruises. If they do sports and stuff and they're bleeding all the time, it's a lot more abnormal. Whereas, again, I started my menstrual cycle at 11, and I have had the most horrendous time. And
I'm so sorry to hear that.
A lot of women, kind of the same as me, you know, say, oh, I've got really heavy periods. Or the other girls I've spoken to on other research trials said that, you know, they kept going back to their GP because they hadn't been diagnosed, and was going, I'm really struggling. I'm losing so much blood. I'm really anemic. Please help me. And they're going, it's just menorrhagia. Like, and it's because obviously women's health is quite under researched as well.
That's what I was going to say. It's so, just at a baseline, it's frustrating that anything you have is so easily dismissed with that can happen to women. It shouldn't be like that.
No. And also there's a real stereotype that women can't have bleeding disorders, because haemophilia, the most severe type of haemophilia, does only affect men and boys.
When I say it's just associated with men.
Yeah, bleeding disorders are just associated with men. So I, even to fellow kind of health professionals, I always say like, oh, I've got a form of haemophilia, and they go, yeah, but haemophilia is only for boys. And I'm like, yeah, I said, like, my condition comes under the umbrella. That's what I was always told as a child. Like, well, you've got the haemophilia umbrella, and then von Willebrand is like here, but no one knows about it.
Right.
And again, my symptoms, unfortunately, have been really severe because, again, they haven't reacted to treatment as well. And because I'm a woman.
Mhm.
So, yeah, but I think it's really, really important to go for testing. And if you feel that there is something wrong, it's so hard because for me, it's been really difficult, but you need to find someone to listen to you because you know your body best.
Mhm.
And you can't rule anything out until you've had that genetic testing. And it also gives a sense of, I wouldn't say relief, but almost kind of internal validation of going, I know this isn't
Absolutely.
normal.
Mhm.
And I have counselling through the Haemophilia Network, which is really, really good and has really benefited me.
Oh
Um,
yeah, I can imagine.
which, yeah, even though obviously the diagnosis of a rare disease like this, there is no cure, you're born with it, there's nothing you can do about it,
Mhm.
you then are able to, it takes a long time, but almost embrace it as like, okay, these are the cards that I've been dealt.
Mm.
But again, it with treatment options, with different professionals, access to services, things like that, you can try and manage as best as you can.
Mhm, mhm. And then, okay, so you kind of just covered my immediate follow-up question, which is for people, I think that there is somewhat of a mentality in patients who have rare diseases that don't have current treatments of why bother getting tested? I know my symptoms. I kind of know how to manage them. Nothing's going to change. What would you say to patients like that, and why you think it's still important to find these answers?
I think it's still really important because, again, healthcare is forever changing and innovating. And I always say, even in people in my profession, think back to 100 years ago and what we did 100 years ago to do with healthcare, and think about where we are now. Or even if you think back to when I was first diagnosed,
Mhm.
no one knew about it. Whereas I'd like to say that more people know about it, but they don't. But even so, the research now that's saying actually it can affect, more than 1% of the world's population, and you're going, oh my
Absolutely.
goodness, actually this is so much more common than we think. It's
It
just not
is.
about.
Mhm.
um and you're able to raise more awareness. And again, I think as well that even though if you do have your established diagnosis, going for genetic testing can also help, again, explain some other things as well, but also
Uh-huh.
um, again, push forward the boat for those people who haven't even got to that stage yet. It then, widens up the symptom frame of, oh, okay, these people have this established genetic
Mhm.
condition, but now we're understanding that actually it might be a wider variety of symptoms, which means those that are really suffering without a diagnosis in the first place, that extra symptom being added to that list might make one doctor go, oh, actually, maybe we should look into that.
Exactly. It's about putting together a patient profile to help these patients not slip through the cracks. And that's sort of where the basis of probably genetic started was the patient has all of the information. The patient has all of their phenotypic data. They know all of their symptoms better than any doctor who's going to sit down with them for 10 minutes is going to recognize. So to your earlier point about validation and just listening to your body, knowing something's wrong and initiating something for yourself, like genetic testing, or being connected with clinical trials. I also love your mindset. And I think this is not unique to you, but I think being in the healthcare field, you're more aware of it than others. And that is that our CEO, Lucas, was always saying that people sort of outside of healthcare think of it as very stagnant. There's a treatment or there isn't. And I
Yeah.
think to your point about putting yourself in the mindset of looking at treatment options 100 years ago, looking back, we think how quickly that evolved. But in the moment, you just think, well, there's not a treatment for this. So
Yeah.
it is what it is. And that's hopefully not the case for too much longer. Let me see. I know we're well past time. I'm so sorry. I
No,
wasn't
no,
looking
no, no.
at all.
I'm absolutely fine if you want to continue.
Okay.
Um,
I appreciate it so much. I will not take too much
okay.
more of your time. I just want to review this list and see if there's anything that we haven't covered. Um, Honestly, I think we got it all. You've done this before, and we kind of just went absolutely, ran the gamut. But do you have anything else that you want to add, or you think it's important to get out to this community?
I think I've got two things specifically. I think the first one is, I guess, because what you do goes out to people with rare diseases. I think it's really important with advocacy as well. And I can say this from a nurse perspective, but I can also say this from a patient perspective. It's really, talking to you about advocacy now is really easy because I'm not in hospital, I'm not unwell, but people with rare diseases will know when you are admitted into hospital, you are likely to find that everyone looking after you does not know about your condition. And that can be really, really scary, especially with a bleeding disorder. And even though I'm now a registered professional, I've had 3 separate occasions where I have become so much more unwell due to my treatment not being given, or it being withheld, or not being given properly. And it's just because of lack of awareness, and people don't know, which I think is a really important thing to kind of share, even though it's obviously not a positive thing, but to actually share that it isn't just bleeding disorders, it's other rare diseases. I know that people with endocrine diseases and like Addison's, like that, it's really important, and they really struggle when they're in hospital, because they're going, if I start to feel like this, you need to give me this now. And they're going, oh, but you're not even in here for that reason. And it's like, that doesn't matter, because whenever you're in hospital, even if you're in for a different reason, your rare disease is still there. And often it can tie into a lot of other things. Because your rare disease isn't just on its own. And I think that's what a lot of, there's a big misconception that it's just that and it doesn't affect anything else. But obviously with a bleeding disorder, it affects your entire body system.
Absolutely.
And it kind of leads me on to my next point, really, of people with rare diseases. It sounds, it's happened to me, which again, I've learned from a lot of other women doing research who have von Willebrand that it's happened the opposite way to them. But I obviously was diagnosed very early. I was very lucky to have that. But it also stopped me from getting further diagnosis. Because everything then gets blamed on your rare disease.
Oh, I see.
Even things that are very,
it just acts as a catch-all.
Yeah, because they're going, there's this phrase that's used. I don't know if it's used in America, but it's used in the UK a lot. When you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras. So
that's
it's a phrase.
It's
a phrase that's used in healthcare, where it's like, okay, don't go for the when you're looking for diagnosis, don't go for a big one. Always think of the most common one. So then when you do have an established rare disease, when you then go, something else is different, they're going, oh, but you've already got that. Almost like, well, you can't have another one, but they're like, oh, but that probably relates to that. Or that probably relates.
You're already labeled as an outlier. And so, so it's a very easy out. Yeah.
Yeah. And that, unfortunately, especially being a woman, I ended up getting diagnosed with severe endometriosis and polycystic ovaries, even though from the age of 11, I was going to hospital going, I'm in so much pain. And they're like, oh, well, it's just periods. And, oh, well, your periods are bad because you have a bleeding disorder. And I'm going, no, there's something wrong. And they're always going, no. And again, I would end up in hospital so unwell. I'd be bleeding so heavily that I'd be in hospital for 4 or 5 days. And I'd have doctors turn around to me and say, it's just your bleeding disorder. And I was going, it isn't. I know it isn't. But even that, having a rare disease, it's like, oh, well, you've already got one, so you can't have anything else.
It feels so horrible to be dismissed like that. And I think, and feeling like there's not much else you can do. I can imagine that starts absolutely getting to you after a while, and just thinking, well, now I'm not even going to do anything about this because I know exactly what the responses are going to be. I'm going to be dismissed. And I know how to manage my symptoms well enough at home, or whatever the mindset is. And I think it's really important to bring resources to people so that they can start patient initiated, dives into figuring out how to manage their care better, trying to find answers, and being able to bring a test to someone and say, no, listen to me. Like, these are my results. We know that there's something going on here and we need to do something about it. Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah. And I think as well, like I'd gone through my whole journey with my bleeding disorder, and even my own hematology consultant who does von Willebrand's and hemophilia for a living, who is so experienced. He retired 2 years ago, but even he said, he's like, Grace, I've never seen this. And he was going to these gynecologists and going, please help her. I don't know what to do. This isn't related to anything that I do with her. And they were going, no. And they were going, no. And then it wasn't until, unfortunately, I had to go privately. I had to pay for my own surgery because, again, because of my bleeding disorder, no one would operate, because obviously they were like, oh, well, she's got a bleeding disorder, so we won't do any intervention because then we have to, that's just going to mess up everything. So yeah, I then had to go privately, which they removed a really large nodule, like the size of my thumb, that had been like pressing on for so long.
Oh my God.
And then I was able to, obviously my consultant immediately was really happy for me and was just like, I'm so glad we finally got you sorted. But then again, it was looking back at my previous hospital admissions going, I knew there was something wrong. And again, it wasn't until I then had my private surgery where, because I'd gone privately, the consultant then said, oh, there's actually in London, which again is obviously the capital of the UK, but it's where all of the specialisms are for healthcare. They then said, oh, there's actually a joint like hemophilia and gynecology clinic. And I was like, what? And they were like, yeah, have you never heard of it? I was like, no. No,
It's very relevant. Why has no one told me?
No, I've never, ever heard of this. And, he was like, oh, yeah, she's done like my consultant, he was like, she's done so much research into women with von Willebrand's and, And he was like, do you want to be referred to her? Because I don't really know what to do. I was like, yeah, absolutely. And she has changed my life. Like, as soon as I went up to see her, she was so upset and she was so angry when she heard my story, because she was able to explain to me in 2 sentences why I had endometriosis. Like, she was like, Grace, you do have a bleeding disorder, so you bleed so much and then you backflow and all of your blood goes outside of your uterus. And that's why you're in so much pain. And
that must have been so validating and so frustrating at the same time.
Yeah, but since I've met her and Keith Gomez, who's one of their hematology consultants, she was the one who was then going, right, well, if you haven't had response to this treatment and everything like that, well, then we need to do genetic testing. So she got me that genetic testing, which then showed actually, I do metabolize the treatment so quickly. It isn't my fault. There's nothing I can do, but that explains what's been going on. And again, she explores every single treatment option that can control like my gynecology on its own, as well as accepting, yes, my bleeding disorder is going to have an impact, but actually we need to sort this out because, that still exists. So and again, having awareness and access to services like that, who then also again have access to these trials and information like that, is so important. And again, that's something that is definitely not kind of being made aware as much as it should.
Absolutely. I mean, you're very active in the patient community, and it's still, think about how many years it took you to hear about this specialist, get into this specialist, be treated by this specialist. You can imagine people who have no idea what's going on still with their bodies and how far it can feel away from getting to the proper resources. And that's just so frustrating for everyone to hear. And that's basically the bottom line of what we're trying to do at Probably Genetic, is just making it easier for people to get access to testing, and then using that testing as a door to open towards resources, specialists, clinical trials, and just information and feeling like you're connected and in the know with updates that are happening in the area. And yeah, just to your point of advocating for yourself and knowing when something isn't right and feeling like there is a path for you to start initiating your own treatment, or at least finding answers for yourself. And that's why, that's why I love having these conversations. I love meeting people like yourself, and you're just, I mean, a beacon of hope, right? Because not only have you taken it upon yourself to find what is right for you and what's going on and finding your own answers, but you're also part of the healthcare system. Like, you've seen what works and honestly where the system is broken. And while that's disheartening, it's also super impactful to hear you talk about it. So I just thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with me. Is there anything else you want to add to? I didn't mean to cut that off at all.
No.
Are willing.
I don't think so. I think, to be fair, there's probably one other little story, which is actually from me being a nurse rather than being a patient. But I did a rotation in pediatric intensive care when I was like studying to be a nurse, and I got assigned to look after this very like complex young man. He was 15, who was going in for surgery for scoliosis. So he's having the big like metal bars put in and things like that. So they often spend a night in intensive care after their surgery just to make sure they're stable enough to go back to the wards. And I was working with my nurse, and the consultant was giving the handover and was saying about this patient, and he goes, "Oh, and they've got this weird bleeding thing, and I have no idea what it is. And apparently we're meant to keep this medicine in the fridge, and I had to get units of blood and all this." He was like, "All this crap, and I don't know what it is, but whatever, like just look after this patient." And I was going, and he said something about factor 8, which is like the factor that I have. And
oh my gosh.
So I was then reading up on this patient that was about to come to us, and it said that he had von Willebrand's, and I was like, oh, okay. And then I was reading through his notes, and he'd only just been diagnosed.
Oh my gosh.
And he was 15, and he was a very, very complex child with a lot of disabilities. And he'd already had surgery to have a gastrostomy put in before. So he'd already had invasive surgery with a bleeding disorder. And I was going, how did they not know? And it was only because the consultant who was doing their big spinal surgery did a clotting screen before, because obviously it's really invasive. And I had these parents who were absolutely terrified because there was barely anything to read on von Willebrand's, especially nothing to do with major surgeries like scoliosis. And they were so scared. And I was able to speak to these parents as soon as he came out of theatre to say, like, because none of the healthcare professionals knew what von Willebrand's was, knew what the treatment was, didn't understand why they needed to.
That seems like the scariest part.
They were just like, well, you just follow the they said, oh, well, just follow the major hemorrhage protocol if something happens. And we were sat at the bedside, and the consultant was giving handover, and he goes, and we've got like factor 8 that I think needs to go in the fridge or not. And he kind of looks around, and me being the student nurse, I was the most like junior there, and I said, factor 8 can be kept in the fridge, but actually if you take it out of the fridge, then it has a shelf life of a month. And everybody turns to me and they go, how do you know that? And I was like, oh, I've got von Willebrand's, to the point where the consultant drops all of the notes that he has and goes, if you've got any questions, ask her, and just leaves to go.
Oh my gosh.
And I was going, okay. And again, everybody turned to me and went, so what do we do if he bleeds? I was like, well, one, we need to look at his dressing sites before we do anything. And I said he'll have a plan of having like factor 8 and von Willebrand factor like should be 4 hours after surgery, and then 8 hours after that, depending on his levels, because you do pre and post, because it's prophylactic. Like, you need to make sure that his levels are stable as a normal person's, because this is a major surgery. But again, it doesn't involve the bleeding disorder, having, you know, a curved spine, but the process of fixing it. And I said, you know, you need to bleep the haemophilia clinical nurse specialist if you're concerned. And not just wait until he has a major hemorrhage, because otherwise he will be very, very poorly. And yeah, they were like, oh, thanks. Like, I had no idea about this. And I was like, yeah, I have it. I was like, it's actually really common. And then I had the time, and I was able to sit down with these two parents who were just absolutely beside themselves, because they were obviously worried about the surgery, but then being told, like, oh, actually, he has a bleeding disorder. We don't know a lot about it.
And it's being referenced very flippantly.
Yeah, but it, you know, could have a massive impact. And I was able to sit down with them both and say, like, he's in really good hands. I'm going to have a look about his treatment plan from his hematologist, and everything's going to be okay. And they were like, how do you know? And I was like, I've actually got von Willebrand. They were like, oh, they just gave me a massive hug. And I was like, it's okay. Like, he is going to be okay, I promise. And if we do have any problems, we'll call his hematologist. We'll call the nurses, and that's okay. Like, just because he has this bleeding disorder doesn't mean that he can't get better from this spinal surgery. It just means that he needs a little bit of extra help, and that's okay. And that's what we're here for. And yeah, that was a major kind of turning point in my kind of nurse training, where I was like, this is why I'm doing this. Because even though it was just one patient and one family, I was like, you know, even just that little bit more of awareness. And you know, even though, you know, people are like, oh, well, look at the bigger picture, this child's really complex anyway, he's got lots of disabilities, like, oh, the bleeding disorder doesn't matter. I'm like, well, you think of the psychological impacts that you know had on his poor parents, where his spine's being cut open, and oh my god, is he going to bleed out? Like, and also they was like, are we really bad parents for not knowing? I was like, no, not at all.
Also just gives me chills, because can you imagine how badly your mom needed someone like you there saying that to her, and she didn't get that?
So yeah, it was a really lovely, like, full circle moment where I was able to provide that care. And it's definitely not something I'm ever going to forget. But again, just the fact that unfortunately it is a system that needs to be changed in terms of awareness, and clinical trials and more drugs coming out is part of this, and research is part of this, to actually get the word out. And again, having more published papers, so actually when, you know, doctors and consultants are having to do their training, they're then looking and going, oh, okay, there's actually more papers on this, and there's more evidence-based research, you know, there's more things coming out about it, which, you know, you do have to start somewhere. And even though I'm, you know, very junior at the bottom of the pile, I still want to try and enforce that.
Absolutely.
And from a patient perspective as well as a healthcare perspective, being like, you know, this is still really important. And, you know, even though we are at the very, again, beginning of what's been quite a stagnant bit of, you know, time for von Willebrand's, that there will be a time for it, and that time definitely feels like it's coming now, which is amazing, and again gives me so much hope as a patient as well as a nurse. So yeah, it's really, really exciting.
Absolutely. This awareness and this advocacy, it's not only going to help identify these patients earlier on, hopefully, but again, to your point, just because there's not a perfect treatment today doesn't mean that's not going to be next year, next month, next week. It finally feels like it has momentum again. And that's the silver lining there, I guess.
Absolutely. And it just, you know, the possibilities are endless, because you don't know what they're going to come out with. And again, I was just so shocked that they've actually come out with a monoclonal antibody, which I was like, wow, you can do so much with that. Like, even if the first lot isn't as good, you then go back to the drawing board and do it again. And like, again, you think of all the research that's come out for cancer treatment, and again, how that's progressed in 5 years, 10 years.
Absolutely.
And it gives you, again, so much hope for, people with rare diseases like me, to then go, oh my goodness, imagine me in 10 years time looking back at myself now going, oh my god, oh my goodness, they had no idea this is going to happen. And
Exactly.
so yeah, really exciting.
Yeah. And people like you who are talking about this is going to be the number one thing that's going to push that forward. So I just thank you so much for taking the time to tell me your story and talk to me